The moment the bulldozer's blade sank into the school's foundation, while kids were still inside, I dropped my wrench, kicked over my workbench, and sprinted to the front gate barefoot. That was my son's classroom, and the HOA president in the safety vest, barking orders like she owned the place. She had no idea that by noon tomorrow, her office would be a smoking crater. Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how we got here. I didn't grow up with much, just calloused hands, hand-me-down boots, and the kind of back that aches in the rain. But I swore when I had kids, they'd get something better. So when my boy turned 6, small and curious with a voice that could outshout a tractor, I did what any stubborn father with a welding license and too much sawdust in his lungs would do. I built him a school. Not just him, of course. All the kids out here. See, our slice of land sat on the outer edge of what the city calls discretionary investment zones, which is a fancy way of saying you're on your own. Our kids had to ride buses an hour each way to a school with more metal detectors than textbooks, and after one too many budget reevaluations shut down arts, music, and the only decent special ed teacher for miles, we'd had enough. A couple of us, retired carpenters, old farmers, a teacher who used to run a Montessori before her roof caved in, we decided to build something. The Creekide School wasn't fancy. It didn't have a gym, or a computer lab, or an Olympic-sized anything. But it had windows that opened, desks made from reclaimed oak, a stove that ran hot in the winter, and a chalkboard big enough for every kid to dream out loud. And it sat on a lot tucked right between the woods and the bend in Dry Creek, technically within the HOA's outer margin, though no one had bothered to enforce anything there in 30 years. We cleared it ourselves. Dug the post holes, hauled the beams, painted the walls with community-raised funds and leftover barn paint. Hell, I even welded the weather vane myself, shaped like a squirrel, because the kids voted for it unanimously. For a while it worked. Real smooth, too. We rotated teaching shifts between Miss Evelyn, who taught science with a slingshot and a rabbit skull, and Coach Donnie, who taught math like it was poker night. My boy learned fractions by cutting pie, not clicking apps, and everyone was happy. Well, almost everyone. Enter Karen, HOA president as of last August. Moved in with a purebred labradoodle and an SUV too shiny for our gravel roads. Had a clipboard in one hand and a Bluetooth earpiece in the other. She had this way of speaking like she was announcing a fire drill. Always smiling. Always condescending. She started small. Notes about trash cans visible from the street. Violations for unapproved porch swings. A letter about inappropriate holiday lighting because our neighbor strung up a nativity scene using a light-up inflatable possum. Petty stuff. But then she started asking questions. "What is this? Structure by the creek?" she asked me once, squinting at the school like it was a meth lab. "That's a one-room schoolhouse, Karen," I said. You know, the kind we had before HOA bylaws tried to gentrify common sense. She didn't laugh, started muttering about permits and liabilities and insurance exposure. She showed up to a board meeting with laminated photos of our playground, claiming the slide angle exceeded safety recommendations and could be a litigation risk. Someone overheard her say rogue daycare. A week later, we got a notice in the mail. Cease and desist. No letterhead, just Willow Bend Ho, stamped like an afterthought, and her name signed in thick blue ink. It cited HOA Article 14, subsection F, which no one had ever enforced, and claimed we were operating an unauthorized educational facility in violation of community land use regulations. The kicker? That land had been vacant for decades before we turned it into something useful. She gave us 10 business days to shut down or face fines accruing daily. We tried to reason with her, brought in parents. Kids. Even had little Becky draw a picture of the classroom with a sun smiling down on it. Karen didn't blink. Said we could petition the board and request a variance, but made it clear she'd already filed for enforcement. I figured we had time. That was my mistake. The demolition crews showed up the next Tuesday. No warning, no mediation, not even a phone call. Just a rental bulldozer, 2 guys in neon vests who looked uncomfortable, and a stack of orange cones with the HOA seal duct taped on, and the school, our school, was in session. My son was inside with 8 other kids, and Miss Evelyn teaching the water cycle. I saw her run out screaming before the first tire touched the gravel. I dropped my ratchet, ran full sprint from the auto shed, and threw myself in front of that machine like some kind of idiot superhero, waving my arms and yelling to shut it down. The driver, to his credit, did. He looked at the paperwork, looked at the terrified kids behind me, and just said, "I thought this was an abandoned shed." Karen showed up 5 minutes later, probably summoned by HOA drone. She was filming everything on her phone and saying, "This is what happens when people break the rules." She didn't notice the kids crying, didn't flinch when a mother collapsed to her knees beside a crushed lunchbox, didn't even acknowledge Miss Evelyn sobbing in the doorway. She just walked around, hands on her hips, muttering, "Non-compliant architecture." That night, we took down what was left of the school, by hand, in silence, in the dark. We salvaged what we could, packed the books, folded up the chalkboard, and laid the weather vane on my truck bed like it was a coffin lid. My son didn't say anything, just stared at the spot where he used to sit cross-legged during story time, holding back tears like a grown man in a child's body. That's when I knew. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about bylaws or permits or creek erosion. This was war. And I was about to show Karen that bulldozers go both ways. You ever try explaining to a 7-year-old why a grown adult bulldozed his classroom? I did. 3 times. Each time, my son just stared at me like I'd started speaking a different language, one where sense and fairness had packed up and left. He didn't cry that night, didn't scream or throw a fit. Just sat on the edge of his bed, clutching the little wooden truck we made in shop class, and whispered, "Will Miss Evelyn still read us stories?" I told him she would. I lied. The next morning, the Creekide lot was taped off like a crime scene, though you wouldn't know who the victim was by how the news told it. Karen had called Channel 5 herself, I later found out. She was already giving statements before the dust settled, standing in front of the bulldozed rubble like it was a terrorist compound, in her pressed blazer and HOA-issued windbreaker. "The structure," she said, lips tight with professional tragedy, "was built without proper permits. We have a duty to protect our community's children from unsafe environments." The anchor nodded solemnly while behind her. A swing set swayed in the breeze, and some kid's papier-mâché solar system laid flattened under a wheel track. "An unlicensed facility," she repeated. "No code compliance, no certified staff, no fire inspection. This could have been a disaster. I watched it from my kitchen, holding the mug my son had painted last Christmas, the one with my name spelled wrong. Half the town believed her. The other half was on fire. Parents flooded the HOA inbox. I know because someone CC'd me on their reply. The HOA thanked them for their input, then doubled down, citing articles from their dusty rulebook no one had read since the Bush administration. I tried the right way first, I swear. Called the city zoning board. They said the school was built on land still technically designated Greenway Utility adjacent, which translated to "not our problem." Tried the county office. "It's a private development," they said. "Your dispute's internal." I hired a lawyer. Well, I tried. The first 3 wouldn't touch it. The 4th gave me a retainer quote that made me reconsider how much I liked justice. Karen had moved fast, sealed every crack. She had filed preemptive complaints with the city. Claimed the school was erected covertly and Posed a credible safety risk. Said we endangered children. That part stung the most. Miss Evelyn had taught for 22 years before retiring to care for her mother. Donnie was a war vet and a math teacher. And me, I was no rogue operator. I had credentials. What no one knew, what Karen definitely didn't know, was that I'd spent 2 decades contracting for the city. Roads, bridges, public libraries. I'd built schools with my hands and watched bureaucrats screw up ones I didn't, and I'd kept records, relationships, favors. That morning, I called up Dale Fisher. Used to be city planner, now semi-retired and running some consulting racket in his garage. I didn't even need to say much, just told him what happened. He let out this long sigh and said, "Son, they really bulldozed it, with kids inside?" I told him yes. Told him about the paper trail, the fake fines, the emergency crew with duct-taped logos. Dale told me to meet him at the records annex. The annex was this cinder block box behind City Hall that smelled like mildew and bureaucracy. We spent 3 hours combing through microfiche, then another hour in the vault. That's when we found it. It was wedged behind an old subdivision charter, signed in 1974 by the original developer of Willow Bend Estates, a guy named Herbert Langston who apparently loved kids, hated rules, and insisted that any land parcel designated for the purpose of youth education or communal instruction shall remain free from regulatory override by local HOA or governing subdivision bodies. In bold. Underlined. Initialed. It was called a Land Use Preservation Covenant, and the lot we built Creekide on, it was shaded in blue ink. Herbie wanted a little red schoolhouse, Dale muttered, eyes widening. Said if no one else built one, somebody ought to. Karen hadn't just stepped on a rake. She'd impaled herself on a century-old clause with teeth. The problem? No one enforced these things unless they were challenged. So I marched back to City Hall and submitted an appeal to the Property Commission. The clerk looked at me like I was dropping off a unicorn. "No one uses these covenants anymore," she said. "It's mostly ceremonial." I said, "Lady, there's nothing ceremonial about demolishing a classroom while a kid is practicing cursive inside. It got filed." That same day, I wrote a formal letter to the HOA board. I cited the covenant, included a map, an affidavit from Dale, and a notarized history of the parcel's designation. I CC'd Karen. She responded by calling it fake documentation and threatened to report me for forgery and defamation of board authority. I laughed out loud. Then I got to work. Because here's what happens when you spend 20 years building other people's mistakes. You learn exactly how to unravel them. I filed for a temporary injunction with the county court just to stall her next move. Got the local paper to run a piece too. Father rebuilds community school. Faces demolition from HOA. A real feel-good hit. Especially after I emailed them the video footage of Karen watching the demolition with a smile. Then I called every parent I knew. We organized, circulated a petition, held a candlelight vigil on the gravel lot. The kids drew signs that said things like, "Learning is not a violation," and "Let me read, Karen." Meanwhile, I worked nights and weekends pulling every record from the HOA's inception. Turns out Karen had been rewriting bylaws without a full board vote, and the emergency demolition, it hadn't even been approved by a majority. Just rubber-stamped by her husband and the HOA treasurer, both of whom had business ties to the demolition contractor. The cherry on top? I found a memo from Karen 3 weeks before the demolition, pitching plans for a private dog park on the very same land. Community space potential, it said. I printed everything. Stacked it in a box. Took it with me to the county hearing. Karen showed up with 2 lawyers, a printout of bylaws, and the smug expression of someone who still thinks they're winning. But when I laid that covenant down on the table and pointed to Langston's original signature, the room changed. When I played the footage of kids crying during demolition, the judge flinched. When I passed out notarized letters from 3 parents describing the trauma their children experienced after losing the school, especially after thinking they were in danger during the bulldozer incident, the judge stopped taking notes and just stared at Karen like she was gum on the courtroom floor. "This isn't just a zoning mistake," the judge said finally. "This is negligence, and it's possibly criminal." Karen tried to object, but her own lawyer grabbed her arm. I left that courtroom with a stay order, a pending injunction, and the green light to start laying the foundation again, legally, permanently, on land that Karen no longer had an ounce of control over. And the best part? I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Because if she thought she could erase a school with a bulldozer and a laminated rulebook, then she was about to learn what a real demolition looked like. One legal clause at a time. There's a difference between getting even and getting it done right. After the court ruling, after the newspaper article, after Karen had to issue a public statement that managed to not include the word sorry even once, I didn't yell, I didn't post. I didn't stomp through HOA meetings demanding justice. I disappeared. At least, that's what Karen thought. But what I actually did was spend every spare hour out back behind city records, in a room full of dead maps and zoning stamps, learning every code this county had on the books. Because if Karen wanted to play the regulation game, I was about to show her what happened when someone who actually knew how to build things took over the board. First thing I did was lease a parcel of land beside the HOA office. Technically, it had been marked for utility overflow storage since 1992, but no one used it for anything but stacking dead Christmas trees and housing a raccoon family that smoked cigarettes. I swear one of them held eye contact with me while flicking ash. I submitted paperwork to clean up the shed on the lot. It was barely standing. The roof had caved in, siding peeled off like an onion with rot. I filed every form: permit for restoration, permit for electrical inspection, permit for structural reinforcement. Not one neighbor questioned it, because Karen didn't mention it. She thought I was fixing up a trash pile. Let me work in peace. For once, I cleaned it out, restored the beams, rewired the box, repainted it in approved HOA beige just to be safe. From the outside, it looked like a compliance office or maybe a glorified tool shed. On the inside, it was Command Central. I hung up all my research, photos, violation letters, meeting minutes, every petty ruling Karen had issued since taking power. I started highlighting trends. That's when I realized it wasn't just me. She fined a 3rd grader for having a visually disruptive Pokemon backpack that didn't match HOA-approved colors. She banned Halloween decorations due to occult symbolism, and then approved a 15-foot inflatable turkey for Thanksgiving the very next week. She made an 83-year-old war veteran replace his driveway because the cracks exceeded aesthetic tolerance levels. I put out the word, quietly through the grapevine, I was building something. And anyone who'd ever been on the wrong end of a laminated citation was welcome. They came in pairs, then in groups. A dad who was fined $300 for allowing his toddler's tricycle to be parked within visible sightline of the curb. A teacher who got slapped with a notice because her welcome mat had a pun. Oh, hello there. A man who lost his wife last year and couldn't afford to repaint the trim in time before Karen sent him a $200 bill from the mandatory HOA aesthetic partner. I invited them in, made coffee, printed out complaint forms for every one of them, taught them the appeals process, taught them how to fight back. Then I called in some old favors. I knew people in procurement, people in code enforcement, people who'd spent the last decade getting bulldozed by HOA empires like Karen's. I asked the questions no one asks. Like who approved the HOA office itself? Who signed off on the original permits? Turns out, nobody. Karen had retrofitted an old realtor's kiosk 3 years ago into a community operations center, never filed zoning updates, never cleared the setback limits. The office technically sat 2 feet too close to the greenway and 6 inches into a shared public use easement. It was out of code in 3 directions and registered as a temporary modular space on city maps, which meant it was never supposed to have a permanent foundation or air conditioning, which it had. I smiled so wide I pulled something in my cheek. Because I had what I needed, I filed suit under the same covenant she tried to use against me. Claimed the HOA office was in violation of public use zoning and had been operating without proper designation. Submitted 3 photos, 2 affidavits, and 1 laminated county map older than Karen's Botox. Filed for an injunction. Won it in 7 business days. Karen didn't even show up to the hearing. Claimed a prior commitment. By the time the court ruling came in, I had already bought 2 bulldozers. One used Komatsu from a guy in Amarillo who wore a Crocs and Spurs combo like it was formal wear, and a slightly newer Deere with a cracked seat and an air freshener that smelled like bad decisions. Both were mine. Both were legal, and both had permits filed to relocate non-permitted modular structures on non-conforming land usage parcels. I filed for removal, attached the court ruling, got the green light. It was surgical. I showed up on a Tuesday morning wearing a reflective vest and the calm resolve of a man about to get biblical. The office was locked, but I had already issued a notice of operation through the county. Posted it in triplicate, took pictures, waited the minimum grace period, and then I fired up the Komatsu. The growl of that engine was sweeter than revenge. Karen showed up halfway through. She came screeching into the parking lot in her Lexus, hair half-styled, phone in hand. "You're out of your mind!" she screamed, stepping right into the caution tape. "This is criminal." "I've got the permit," I said, handing her the paperwork like a wedding invitation. Signed, notarized, reviewed by county inspection. Office is sitting on a non-conforming parcel in violation of Municipal Code 311B. Per the ruling, you've got 2 options. Remove it or let me do it. This is abuse of power. She spat. "You're abusing your position to retaliate against." "Actually," I said, smiling just enough to be rude, "this is me complying, for once." She screamed something into her phone. I'm not sure who she was calling. The mayor? Her hairdresser? Satan? Didn't matter. The second bulldozer rolled in 15 minutes later, driven by Donnie, who hadn't smiled that wide since 8. Together, we cut through the foundation like it was butter, ripped out the concrete, stacked the siding, and relocated the HVAC unit to the grass like a trophy. People came out to watch. Kids on scooters, retired couples with folding chairs. One guy even brought popcorn. When the office came down, the whole neighborhood cheered. Someone played the national anthem. Someone else brought me a beer. I took a sip, standing atop the Komatsu like a victorious general, as Karen stood there frozen, holding a clipboard that no longer meant anything. I didn't say a word to her. Just climbed down, patted the bulldozer like it was a loyal dog, and walked home through a line of neighbors high-fiving me like I'd just landed a moon shuttle. That afternoon, I mailed the HOA a fresh application. Permit request to rebuild the Creekide School. This time with city support, community backing, and an ironclad deed that declared the land off limits to HOA interference. Karen tried to appeal. She didn't get far. Seems once your office is declared a legal hazard and physically removed, people stop taking your bylaws seriously. She held one more board meeting from her garage. Only 3 people showed up. One of them was just there to borrow a rake. The HOA voted to remove her by majority. She moved 2 weeks later, listed her house as is, sold it at a loss, and the raccoons moved into her backyard. I never saw her again. but every now and then, when I hear the hum of a lawnmower or the distant chatter of a PTA meeting, I think about the look on her face when the office hit the ground. Bulldozer justice, we called it, and justice had never rolled smoother. The town never forgets a good story, especially one where the bad guy gets flattened, literally. By Wednesday morning, the clip of the HOA office tumbling like a Jenga tower had gone viral. Someone added slow-mo and dramatic music. A local dad edited in Karen's face superimposed on the Death Star. "Ho destroys kid's school, loses office in legal countermove," screamed the headline on the Channel 7 news site. The comments were ruthless. One read, "Imagine being so committed to enforcing mulch uniformity that you bulldoze a school." Another, "Karen found out the hard way. Bulldozers can go both directions." Within 24 hours, 4 different papers ran with the story. National news picked it up by the weekend. And just like that, what started as a small-town spat turned into a full-blown lesson in poetic justice. But I wasn't done, not even close. See, what the HOA didn't realize was that by demolishing the school, they didn't just kick over a shack, they triggered a legal chain reaction. The court granted me not only an injunction but damages, real ones, the kind of damages that require accountants to explain with pie charts. Pain and suffering, educational disruption, structural loss, public endangerment. It added up. The judge called their actions grossly negligent. The insurance company called it indefensible. Karen called it a misunderstanding. I called it karma with a concrete mixer. The payout was 6 figures. Tax to hell, sure, but more than enough. We broke ground on the new Creekide School 6 weeks later. We didn't just rebuild, we went bigger, and this time we went official. I filed every permit, hired licensed surveyors, even got the fire marshal to personally walk the blueprint before we laid the foundation. Miss Evelyn cried when we showed her the new library plans. Donnie bought a whistle so nice it came in a velvet box. The kids helped paint the walls. Every one of them signed a beam before we sealed it into the roof. It wasn't just a school. It was a message carved in drywall and steel. Try to bury us and we'll plant a fortress. The community pitched in like I've never seen. Retired contractors framed walls. Teenagers laid sod. Grandparents baked casseroles for workers who didn't even live here. The city council showed up with donuts one day. I had to build a whole new parking lot just to fit everyone coming to help. And the best part? Karen couldn't do a damn thing about it. Not from her rental in the next town over. Not after everything came out. Turns out, the school wasn't the only thing she bulldozed. A few persistent neighbors, and one anonymous packet of documents I may have mailed to the city auditor, revealed a few, let's say, discrepancies in Karen's background. Her master's in municipal leadership. Fake. Her certification in urban governance. Bought online. And that landscaping company she kept funneling HOA contracts to. Owned by her cousin's husband's tax shelter, LLC. She'd skimmed tens of thousands from the community maintenance fund and buried it in miscellaneous beautification expenses. The spreadsheet even had a line item labeled Karen's bonus. Shh. The fallout was beautiful. The HOA scrambled to contain the blast, but it was like trying to mop up a hurricane with a napkin. Board members resigned in a panic. A forensic audit followed. Karen tried to file a defamation lawsuit against me, then quietly dropped it when my lawyer filed a counterclaim with triple the evidence. She went dark after that, deleted her social media, left town. Rumor is she works as a receptionist at a dental office now. I'd say I feel bad, but I don't. Justice shouldn't be polite. The final death knell came 3 months later, when the neighborhood held an emergency vote. Turnout was the highest in HOA history. The motion was simple: dissolve the HOA and replace it with an elected community council. The vote passed 93-7. The 7 no votes were all from homes previously benefiting from accidental leniency under Karen's rule. They were politely booed. The new council set its first order of business: never allow a single unelected board to bulldoze a school again. We put it in writing. The day Creekide School reopened, the whole town showed up. There were balloons, a ribbon cutting, even a local band that used to tour county fairs. Miss Evelyn gave a speech so moving that two hardened ranchers cried into their flannel. Donnie handed out tiny diplomas that said, "Certified Creekside Builders." My son was the first kid through the front door, lunchbox in hand, eyes wide with joy. He stopped to read the plaque by the entrance, chiseled into granite and set deep into the foundation. Built by the people, taught by fire. I added that last part myself. It felt right. The kind of thing you can point to when people ask what happened here. After the ceremony, I walked back to my porch, coffee steaming in my hand, muscles sore in the way that feels earned. I sat down, watched the sun rise behind the new schoolhouse roof, and took a long sip. The wood was still fresh, the grass not fully grown, but it was ours. Every nail, every beam, every scar. And just when I thought the day couldn't get better, I heard it. The unmistakable, righteous crow of Cluck Norris, the neighborhood's rogue rooster, strutting across the schoolyard like he owned the place. He disappeared after the demolition. We thought he was gone for good, but there he was, flapping his ridiculous wings, pecking at invisible enemies, reborn from the ashes like a poultry phoenix. The kids ran to greet him, shrieking with laughter. Miss Evelyn smiled, Donnie saluted, and I just watched. That damn bird survived it all, just like we did. The HOA thought they could break us with bylaws and bulldozers. They thought they could erase what we built with threats and fines. But you can't bulldoze grit. You can't regulate community. And you sure as hell can't stop a determined town with a rooster named Cluck Norris.